Hey, it's Yayforyarn, and today I'm unboxing the May 2020 KnitCrate. Alright, so I got my KnitCrate in the mail. It's a little bit different packaging than normal. We got bubble mailers instead of boxes again, and I don't mind that at all. It's just a little different because they're black instead of green this time, but it doesn't really matter. So this month they're doing something a little different with the yarn in the knit crates. So I guess they weren't able to get the yarn produced that they had in mind for this crate. So instead, they went to their sister company, which is a company that supplies undyed yarn for people to dye themselves, and they are sending us, instead of hand-dyed yarn, we're going to get to hand dye our own yarn. So this is going to be super cool. Let's see what's in here. All right. So here is the yarn, and I'm not sure what type of yarn this is, but it is very smooth, very soft, but it's not exactly white. It's more of like a creamy yellow, like not quite yellow, but it has like a yellow tint to it. It's like a yellowish cream color on its own. So this is our base yarn, and it comes twisted like this. Not as pretty as the twist that we normally see once a skein is already dyed, but we got 2 skeins of this, and then here are the dyes. We're basically going to dye this with Kool-Aid. So I got a red and an orange, and there are supposed to be some videos that go along with this crate to show you how to do the dyeing process. Now I have to go and watch those before I can dye my yarn, but there's my dye. And then this is a cute little set of sticky notes and sticky note flags, which could be really handy if you are going through like a pattern or whatever and you want to mark places in the pattern that you want to take note of, or if you want to add notes to your pattern without writing on the page, like if it's in a book or something. And that would also be really handy just to kind of mark your spot and place a sticky note underneath the row you're working on. That's what I like to do. So those are pretty neat. And then these are zip ties, and I actually know what these are for because I've seen hand-dyed yarn enough to get an idea of what this is used for. Once the skeins are untwisted for the dyeing, I think you use the zip ties to kind of hold the bundles of yarn together so they don't get all tangly when you're dyeing them. And then here is the card. The theme is blank canvas, so we're going to get to dye it ourselves on blank yarn. So here's the back of the card, and here's the link to where you can get the videos that show you how to dye it with the Kool-Aid. And for this month's patterns, they're not actually creating new patterns. They're re-releasing several past patterns that can be used with the yarn base. So the yarn does not have a tag on it, and that's because it tells you what the type of yarn is on the card. So I got the nice and round base, which is pure superwash merino, and it's a fingering weight, and of course they are 100-gram skeins. All right, so that is what's in the crate. So the next step for me is to go watch the videos that show you how to dye this yarn with Kool-Aid, and I'm going to go watch those videos and try it out, and then we'll see how it turns out, and I will show you what the finished yarn looks like. Alright, so after watching some of the ChemKnit's Kool-Aid dyeing tutorials, I've decided how I'm going to dye this. Now, there are a bunch of different tutorials on her channel. I will link to some of them down below, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the dip dye method that she shows in one of her more recent videos, except instead of dip dyeing the skein, which gives you kind of like an ombre back and forth between 2 colors, I'm going to dip dye a blank. And what that's going to give me is a gradient yarn. So basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to knit my yarn into a tube on my Addi Knitting Machine, and then I'm going to dye the tube of pre-knitted yarn. And that will give me a long ombre kind of effect, so that once I unravel that blank, which is the tube, then the entire skein will gradient. It'll have like an ombre from one color to the other. So, because I want both of my skeins to be the same, from what I have read, that means I need to knit my tube double-stranded. So I'm going to take a strand from each of these skeins and hold it double and knit onto the Addi Knitting Machine. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take each of these, I'm going to take apart the skein as it is already twisted, and I'm going to take this hank of yarn, just the big loop that it is right now, and I'm going to put both of these onto my yarn swift at the same time, and then I'm going to pull one strand from each skein from the yarn swift and feed it directly from the yarn swift to the machine. And I'm just going to knit a tube until I run out of yarn, and then I can dip dye the knitted tube and get a gradient effect instead of dip dyeing the skein like this and getting what will knit up or crochet up as a more variegated type of yarn. So in her dip dye tutorial, she used the same two colors of Kool-Aid that I have, but what I would like to do is I would like to tone down these colors. So I've never done this before, but I'm just going to guess that by using less of the powder in the pot when I dye the yarn with the dip dye, I could theoretically get a softer color from both of these. So I'm going to use maybe half or 2/3 of the orange powder in the one dip dye, and then once that has already absorbed into the yarn with that gradient, then I'm going to add the red and maybe only do like 1/3 of the red powder. I'm going to try that and see how it works. And then with what's left of the powder, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to save both of what's left of each of these powders, and then once my blank, my knitted tube, has been dip dyed, I'm going to let it cool, and of course it's already going to be soaking wet, so I'm going to let it cool, and I'm going to squeeze out the extra water, and then I'm going to lay it out on some plastic wrap on the counter and sprinkle what's left of the powder all over it on all sides to get a speckled look, because I really like speckled yarn. So I'm going to speckle it after it's already been dip dyed, and then what she tells you to do in her speckling video is take the whole blank or skein or whatever and roll it up in the plastic wrap that it's laying on, and then you can either microwave it or put it into a steamer basket instead of boiling it. So I'm probably going to do the steamer basket method and see if I can get some red and orange speckles on top of my gradient dip dyed sock blank. So what I would like to get is maybe a softer, kind of more peachy orange, and maybe a softer, like a faded red, or maybe even closer to a pink. We'll see how that goes. But I'm really excited to try this. This is going to be so much fun. And I should also mention that before I do the dip dye, I'm going to soak my knitted tube in water first. And from what I've seen of her videos, making sure the yarn is wet before you put it in the dye pot helps make sure that the color absorbs evenly. Even though we're going to be dip dyeing it for a gradient, that's not what I'm talking about. Evenly as in it won't be like splotchy where that there are some kind of like a tonal dye where that there are some strands that have a little bit less dye on them even in the same part of the skein. So I'm going to go for that smooth gradient where it's just going to flow into the other color. So I'm going to pre-soak my knitted tube in room temperature water before I do the dip dye. Then once it's cool, I'm going to squeeze out the extra water, lay it out on the plastic wrap, speckle it, and then put it rolled up in the plastic wrap into the steamer basket and see if I can get some speckles in there. So I'm going to go ahead and knit up my tube and try all of that, and we will see how that works. And of course, once it's done, then of course it needs to cool and be washed with like a gentle soap and water, and then I will let it dry and I will show you what my finished blank looks like. All right, so here is my blank. I have finished dyeing it and it has dried. So here's essentially what I did. My knitted tube is made with doubled yarn, so both strands, like a strand from both skeins, is knit together here to try to make the whole skein on each of these more consistent so that it matches the other one closer. So what I've got here is I dip dyed. I basically folded the whole thing in half because it was too long, and even then it was still really long. I dip dyed this end first in the orange, and I used about 2/3 of the Kool-Aid powder in the orange. So I basically held it by this end and I dipped the other end, which is the folded end of my blank, in and out of the pot to soak up that dye in like a gradient effect. And then once this was cool, I put the red Kool-Aid in the pot, and I used about 1/3, maybe slightly over 1/3 of the packet of the red, and I dip dyed these two ends by holding the folded end, and this came out with a softer coral color, which was what I wanted. So I am really liking the actual base color that this came out as. And then while my blank was still wet, I laid it out on plastic wrap and I speckled it with the remaining powder. Now my speckling is not super even. You can see how there are some patches here that are kind of more clustered, but I think that will still look okay in the finished knitted fabric because it will not be, it won't end up all in the same place when you've knit it as it does when you've dyed the knitting. Now, the one thing I would do differently if I did this again is these little extra dark splotches right here is where I basically had a bunch of the powder residue on my fingers from sprinkling, and it was kind of sticky. So I just kind of rubbed it off of my fingers over the blank, and that's where I got these darker little splotches. But again, I think that will also spread out a little more in the finished product and not be quite as dark as far as showing up so much. So now that my blank is dry, the final step is for me to unravel this and wind it into 2 gradient cakes. So I'm basically going to start at one end, unravel the whole thing, separating the 2 yarns, and then wind each pile of yarn that's been unraveled into a cake. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, and then we'll see how this looks when it is wound. Alright, so I have finished winding my yarn into skeins, and I am so happy with how this yarn turned out. I love the slightly splotchy, slightly speckly look that it has to it all over. And of course, the pink kind of fades into that orangey yellow in the middle, and then it actually fades back into the pink. You just can't see that because most of the pink from the other end is on the inside. Now on this skein, it looks basically the same as this one. It's just that it's wound a little differently. It ended up winding differently on my winder. It kept kind of sliding towards the end of the yarn ball winder. So this skein is not wound as cake shaped as this one is, and you can't see the color transition quite as well here, but as I was winding this, it looks basically just like this skein, except it's just not showing it as much because of the way that it wound. So would I do this again? Would I dye yarn with Kool-Aid again? Absolutely. This was a lot more fun even than I thought it was going to be, and I loved the option of coming up with my own colorway and using her tutorials as a base for creating my own thing that looks totally different from what they showed in the tutorial videos. So I love my new yarn. I cannot wait to use this in a project. This project was so much fun in getting to dye the yarn myself. I've never done this before, and I am so happy with how it turned out. So thanks so much to KnitCrate for sending me this crate to review. If you want to grab your own KnitCrate, there's only a few more days to get the May crate, so go ahead and click the link in the description box down below and use the coupon code yayforyarn20 for 20% off of your first crate. But in a few more days, starting June 1st, they're going to switch to a different crate. So if you want to grab the May crate, hurry up and grab that real quick while it's still available. And if you have never dyed your own yarn before, I highly recommend that you grab that crate because this was one of the coolest yarns that I have ever had, in the sense that I was able to dye it myself. So this was definitely worth the couple hours that it took to dye it. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up. Let me know if you have ever dyed your own yarn in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe, making sure you click the little bell next to the subscribe button to be notified of new videos. Thanks for watching.